Welcome to our sleep video series, your easiest path to drifting off naturally. These videos are designed to gently guide your mind toward rest. They work in a few simple ways. First, we give your mind something lightly engaging to focus on, not too exciting, not too dull. Just enough to keep your thoughts from wandering, but not enough to keep you awake. Next, through our proprietary neuro-relaxation technique, the pacing of the audio gradually slows as the video progresses. This subtle change encourages your mind to slow with it. The slowdown doesn't happen in a straight line. It follows carefully crafted patterns proven to support deeper relaxation. Finally, every element of the audio is intentionally calm, steady, and pleasantly boring, perfect for helping your mind settle into sleep. Before we begin, I encourage you to subscribe so you always have a new video ready for bedtime. And in return for these videos, we ask just one small favor. Please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, your city, state, or country, and what time it is for you. It motivates our team, helps us understand what's working, and builds a worldwide community of people who fall asleep together each night. It's always inspiring to see how others use these videos. Now, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let yourself unwind.
The first time you smell the circus, you don't smell the popcorn or the cotton candy. You smell the coal smoke and the elephants. It's a thick, musk-heavy scent that rolls off the train cars at 4 in the morning, creeping over the cornfields like a low fog. For a girl in 1920s Iowa, where the air usually smelled of dry dirt and hog manure, that scent was the perfume of God himself. They called it Circus Day. In the newspapers, in the schoolyards, even from the pulpit on Sunday, it was capitalized. Circus Day. But for those of us living it, waiting for it, scraping our pennies together in mason jars buried under the floorboards, it was more like an eclipse. It was the one day where the gray, dusty drudgery of post-war farm life was swallowed whole by a technicolor monster of canvas and glitter. My name is Eliza Malone, but nobody outside of the Census Bureau has called me that since 1922. The world knows me, if they know me at all, as Tiny, just Tiny. It wasn't a clever nickname. It was a descriptor. I stood exactly 4 feet tall in my stocking feet, 75 pounds of farm-fed muscle and stubborn bone. I wasn't a dwarf, I was just halted, a miniature woman. My mother used to say the good Lord ran out of clay when he got to my legs. I was 19 years old when the Ringling Bros and Barnum and Bailey combined shows rolled into Olween, Iowa. 19, but I looked 12, and I felt about 100. You have to understand what the circus meant to a town like Olween. It didn't just visit, it invaded. We heard the rumble first. The rails hummed a low vibration that shook the coffee in your cup. Then came the whistle, that long, mournful cry that promised that somewhere, out there beyond the silos, there was a world that wasn't brown and green. I remember standing on the porch that morning in late June. The sun wasn't even up, just a bruised purple line on the horizon. My father was already out in the barn, milking. That was the life. You woke up, you worked, you ate, you slept, and then you died. Maybe, if you were lucky, you found a husband who didn't hit you too hard. But the circus was the lie we all agreed to believe for 24 hours. I skipped chores, I just walked off. I walked 5 miles to the railhead to watch them unload. That was the real show, the one the townies didn't pay for. It was a military operation of chaos. Men shouting in languages I didn't know, massive draft horses pulling wagons painted in reds and golds so bright they hurt your eyes. And the elephants? Seeing an elephant in a book is one thing. Seeing an elephant push a train car with its head, its skin like wrinkled slate, its eye ancient and knowing, that changes the chemistry of your blood. I watched them raise the big top. It was like watching a cathedral breathe. Hundreds of men, the roustabouts, shirtless and sweating, swinging sledgehammers in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Clang, clang, clang. They pulled the ropes, and that massive white canvas rose up, swallowing the sky. It was the biggest thing I had ever seen. It was the biggest thing anyone in Olween had ever seen. I knew then I wasn't going back to the farm. I looked at my hands, calloused from shucking corn, and I looked at the acrobats stretching near the cookhouse tent. They were creatures of a different species. They walked like gravity was a suggestion they had politely declined. I didn't have an act, I didn't have a costume. I had a Sunday dress that was too tight in the shoulders and a pair of boots with a hole in the sole. But I had something else. I had spent my entire childhood climbing the rafters of our barn, swinging from the hay pulleys, walking the ridgepole of the roof just to feel the wind. Being small meant I commanded my own weight in a way the big folks couldn't. I was dense. I was a coiled spring. I snuck past the no admittance sign near the connection, the canvas tunnel between the dressing tent and the big top. The air back there was different. It smelled of grease paint, desperation, and exotic animals. "Hey, you kid." A man in a checkered suit, chewing on a cigar that looked like a burnt log, shouted at me. He wasn't John Ringling, but he was close enough to the money to matter. He was a scout, a fixer. "I ain't a kid," I said, drawing myself up to my full, unimpressive height. "I want a job." He laughed, a wet hacking sound. "We got enough water, boys. Go home to your mama." "I'm an acrobat," I lied. He looked me up and down. His eyes lingered on my height. "In the circus business, your body is your currency. If you were beautiful, you sold that. If you were distinct, you sold that. I was distinct." "You're a tiny thing, ain't ya?" he muttered, the cigar rolling from one side of his mouth to the other. "What can you do?" I didn't answer. I just looked around. There was a stack of equipment trunks nearby, piled about 6 feet high. Without a running start, I jumped, caught the edge of the top trunk, handstand pressed myself up, held it for a 3 count, toes pointed, just like I'd seen in the pictures, and then backflipped off, landing silently in the sawdust. The man stopped chewing. He took me to Mr. John Ringling, the circus king. He was a big man, imposing, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of expensive ham. He sat in a private wagon that smelled of mahogany and money. He looked at me for a long time. It wasn't a kind look. It was an appraisal. He was looking at me like my father looked at a prize heifer. 19, Mr. Ringling asked. "Yes, sir." "You look 12, that's good. People like 12. It makes the danger look sharper." He tapped a piece of paper on his desk. "Agile, small. We can use you in the spectacle, maybe top of a human pyramid, maybe part of the charivari. We'll find a spot." Then came the paper, the contract. "Standard starting rate," he said, sliding the fountain pen toward me. $15 a week. $15. My father didn't see $15 cash in a month. It was a fortune. It was Rockefeller money. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. "And room and board?" I asked, trying to sound shrewd. "Train berth is provided," he waved his hand dismissively. "Meals in the cookhouse. It's all part of the life, girl, all part of the life." I signed, Eliza Malone. The ink was still wet when I ran back to the farm, shoved 2 dresses and a hairbrush into a pillowcase, and left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to the circus. Don't look." I didn't realize then that $15 a week wasn't $15. I didn't know about the deductions. I didn't know that the provided berth meant a shelf in a rolling oven, and that the meals would be deducted from my pay, along with laundry, costume fees, and a dozen other little taxes on my existence. I didn't know I was signing myself into indentured servitude with glitter on top. But even if I had known, I think I still would have signed. The train ride out of Olween was my first lesson in physics. The Ringling train was a city on wheels, 4 sections, nearly 100 cars. I was assigned to the performer's sleeping car, way back in the line. It wasn't one of the gilt-edged Pullman palaces where the stars lived. This was a sleeper car modified to stack humans like cordwood. My berth was an upper. It was maybe 6 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. A curtain separated me from the hallway, and a thin mattress separated me from the rattling steel frame. But I lay there in the dark, listening to the clack-clack-clack of the wheels eating up the miles, and I grinned into the soot-stained ceiling. We were moving. Moving meant living. The next morning, we were in nothing, just flat, endless motion. I climbed down from my shelf, my body aching from the vibration, and navigated the narrow corridor. It smelled of stale coffee, unwashed bodies, and cheap lavender water. That's when I met May. May Worth. Even in 1922, simply saying her name made other acrobats cross themselves. The Australian wonder. The greatest bareback rider who ever lived. She was standing at the end of the car, smoking a cigarette with a casual elegance that made the tobacco look healthy. She was small, too muscular and compact, wrapped in a silk kimono that had seen better days. "You're the new shrimp," she said. It wasn't an insult, it was just a statement of fact. She had an accent that sounded like she was chewing on gravel, sharp and flat. "I'm Eliza," I squeaked. "You're tiny," she corrected. "Get used to it. Nobody uses real names here. Real names are for the postman." She looked me over, her eyes dark and intelligent. "You sign for 15. I nodded proudly. May let out a short, sharp laugh and blew smoke toward the ceiling vent. "Honey, you're gonna starve. Did you bring your own costumes?" "No, ma'am." "Then you're in the hole already. Wardrobe department charges rental, and don't eat the meatloaf in the cookhouse on Tuesdays. That's yesterday's lion scraps." She flicked ash onto the floor. "And listen to me closely. Stay away from the privilege car. That's where the gambling happens. You don't make enough to lose." She took me under her wing in her own rough way. Not because she was charitable, but because the circus is a tribe. You survive together, or you fall alone. Over the next few weeks, as we rattled through the Midwest, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, I learned the rhythm. The circus doesn't sleep. It naps with one eye open. We would arrive in a town at 4:00 a.m. We had to be ready for the parade by 9:00 a.m. The parade was mandatory. If you missed the parade, you got fined. $1. A whole dollar for sleeping in. I was put in the spec, the grand spectacle. This was the opening number where every breathing creature in the show paraded around the hippodrome track to overwhelm the audience with sheer volume. Because of my size, they dressed me as a pixie. A sequined, scratchy green leotard that smelled of the sweat of the 3 girls who had worn it before me. They perched me on top of a float shaped like a giant swan. It sounds glamorous. It wasn't. It was hot. The sun beat down on the rubberized canvas of the big top, turning the air inside into a humid soup of dust and animal dander. And the noise. You can't explain the noise of 10,000 people screaming, a 30-piece brass band fighting for dominance, and the roar of big cats all bouncing off a canvas roof. It hits you in the chest. It rattles your teeth. But there was magic in the spaces between the misery. One night, somewhere in Kansas, the towns blurred together. Monday was Missouri, Tuesday was who cares. I was sitting on the back steps of the prop wagon, sewing a tear in my tights. A young man sat down next to me. He had wild hair and eyes that looked like they were vibrating. "You're the new tumbler," he said. "And you're the guy with the chair," I replied. He grinned. It was Clyde Beatty. He wasn't famous yet, just a kid, barely older than me, working as an assistant trainer. But he had that energy. That electric current that some circus folks have, where they seem to be living slightly faster than the rest of the world. "Lions don't respect the chair," Clyde said, picking at a callus on his palm. "They respect the intent. They know if you're scared. They can smell the adrenaline. It smells like copper to them." "Does the audience smell it?" I asked. "Nah," he laughed. "The audience smells peanuts and their own desire to see you get eaten. That's what they pay for, Tiny. They pay to see us cheat death. If it looked safe, they'd ask for their nickel back." He was right. I realized that as I watched the crowds during the midway parties. We were curiosities. That's what it felt like to be a performer in the 1920s. We weren't just entertainers, we were specimens. Being 4 feet tall, I caught the brunt of it. In the dining tent, locals would stare. They'd point. "Look at the little dolly," they'd say loudly, as if I couldn't hear or understand English. They wanted to touch my hair. They wanted to see if I was real. They looked at us with a mix of reverence and disgust. We represented freedom, we traveled, we wore spandex, we lived by our own laws. but we were also loose. We were gypsies. The local pastors preached against our morals while the deacons bought front-row seats to see the showgirls' legs. The exploitation was subtle at first. It was the holdback. The management held back a week's pay as insurance so you couldn't just quit in the middle of nowhere. If you left, you lost the money. So you stayed. You stayed because you were broke, and you were broke because you stayed. I remember getting my first pay envelope. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was $6.40. Deductions, the paymaster said without looking up. Cookhouse, $5. Laundry, $1. Costume rental, 50 cents. Train porter fee, 50 cents. Benevolent fund, $1.50. Benevolent fund, I asked. What's that? Pays for your burial if you break your neck, he grunted. Next. I stood there in the dust, holding my $6. I could have bought a bus ticket home. I could have gone back to the corn and the silence. But then the band started up inside the tent. The trombones were sliding into a ragtime march, and the ground started to shake as the elephants lined up for the matinee. And I shoved the $6 into my bodice and went to work. We hit Nebraska in August. It was a furnace. The heat waves shimmered off the rails. We were setting up in a field outside of Omaha. This was a big date. Omaha was a railroad hub, a city with money. The tent city rose up like a miracle. By now, I knew the geography of it. The big top in the center, the menagerie tent attached to the front, the dressing tents in the back, the cookhouse, the horse tents, the blacksmith shop, the barber shop. We were a self-contained civilization of 1,200 people that appeared at dawn and vanished by midnight. This was the day they were moving me up. One of the acrobats in the Risley act, where they juggle people with their feet, had sprained an ankle stepping off the train. Mayworth had spoken to the boss. Put Tiny in, she'd said. She's light, she spins fast, and she doesn't know enough to be scared yet. So there I was in the dressing tent, staring into a cracked mirror propped up on a trunk. The smell of the place was overwhelming. Wet wool, face powder, acetylene lamps. I was applying the grease paint, thick and white, trying to stop my hands from shaking. Don't put it on so thick, a voice said. I turned. It was a woman named Lillian, one of the aerialists. She was beautiful in a hard, tired way. She sat on her trunk, sewing sequins onto a bodice. You sweat through that much paint, it runs into your eyes, you'll be blind up there. She reached over and thumbed some of the white off my cheek. You nervous? I feel like I'm gonna throw up, I admitted. Good, that keeps you sharp. She bit off a thread. Just remember the people out there, they aren't real, they're just a blur, don't look at their faces. If you look at a face, you start thinking about them judging you. You think about the farmer judging the sinner, just look at the lights. Look at your catcher. Suddenly the whistle blew, the first call. The dressing tent exploded into activity. Clowns were pulling on their oversized trousers, cursing in Italian. The Liberty horses were being led to the connection, their plumes tossing. The tumblers were doing back handsprings in the narrow aisles to warm up. I pulled on my new costume. It was silver. It had been cut down from a child's size, but it fit. I felt the fabric tight against my skin. I wasn't Eliza Malone the farm girl anymore. I was Tiny, the flying wonder. I walked to the curtain. The connection. The membrane between the backstage reality and the onstage fantasy. The noise of Omaha was deafening. Thousands of people stomping their feet on the wooden bleachers. The bandmaster raised his baton. The calliope screamed its high, whistling song. The smell of popcorn and sawdust and tiger dung hit me like a physical wave. My heart was beating in my throat, a frantic bird trying to escape. You ready, kid? It was May Worth. She was atop her white stallion, looking like a queen of the underworld. She didn't look down at me, but she knew I was there. Yes, I whispered, then louder. Yes. Then go out there and steal their breath, she said. The curtain pulled back. The spotlight hit the dust motes in the air, turning them into diamonds. The roar of the crowd washed over me, terrifying and seductive. I took a breath of the hot, animal-scented air, stepped out of the shadows, and ran into the light. The light was blinding. It wasn't the soft, golden glow of a kerosene lamp. It was the sharp, hissing white of a carbon arc spotlight, hot enough to singe the hairs on your arms from 20 feet away. I ran into the center ring, my silver costume flashing, and for a moment, the world dissolved into pure sensation. The sawdust beneath my thin slippers felt soft and shifting, like walking on a beach made of wood. The noise of the crowd wasn't a roar anymore. It was a physical pressure against my eardrums, a static wall of expectation. My partner for the Risley act was a man named Nikolai. He was a barrel-chested Bulgarian whose feet were calloused pads of leather. He lay on his back on the trinka, a specially designed cradle, legs in the air, waiting for me. I didn't think about the faces in the stands. I thought about physics. I thought about the fulcrum. I leapt, felt the solid slap of his soles against the small of my back, and then I was airborne. For 3 seconds, I wasn't 4 feet tall. I was infinite. I spun, the tent ceiling blurring into a kaleidoscope of canvas and rope. I saw the rigging, the high wire where the great Wallendas walked, the trapeze bars hanging like pendulums. Then gravity remembered my name and I came down. But Nikolai's feet were there, catching me, tossing me again. Up, down, spin, catch. When I finally landed on the mat, bowing to the quadrants, the applause washed over me. But it wasn't just clapping. I heard the gasps. I heard a woman in the front row, wearing a feathered hat, say loud enough for the whole ring to hear, "Look at it. It's like a little doll come to life." Reference to it, not her it. The adrenaline soured in my veins, turning from champagne to vinegar. I kept smiling, my painted-on red grin never faltered. But as I ran back through the connection, past the clowns and the pungent elephants, I felt the sting of it. I was a marvel, yes, but I was also a monster, a curiosity. That night in Omaha was the beginning of the real work. The debut is the honeymoon. The marriage is the mud. The routine set in fast, and it was brutal. The circus didn't run on magic. It ran on caloric deficit and sheer stubbornness. My day didn't start with the sun. It started with the animals. Since I was low on the totem pole, I was voluntold to help with the morning feed before my own breakfast. Imagine waking up at 4:30 a.m. in a train car that smells of 40 unwashed bodies, your muscles screaming from yesterday's double show. You stumble out into the pre-dawn gray, usually into mud. It rained a lot that summer. Nebraska mud is sticky. It pulls your boots off your feet. You trudge to the menagerie tent, where the air is thick with the scent of hay and warm predators. The elephant trainer was a man named Silas. He had a face like a dried apple and carried a bullhook, a heavy stick with a metal hook on the end, like it was an extension of his arm. I watched him handle the big bulls, the massive male elephants. It wasn't gentle. "Move it, you gray bastard." Silas would scream, driving the hook into the sensitive skin behind an elephant's ear. The animal would trumpet, a sound that vibrates in your chest cavity, and shuffle faster. "Why do you have to hit them?" I asked once, lugging a bucket of water that weighed almost as much as I did. Silas looked at me with dead eyes. "Because fear is the only language a 6-ton animal respects, Tiny. You think they do tricks because they like peanuts? They do it because they don't want the hook." It was a lesson in the hierarchy of power. The owners whacked the managers whacked the performers whacked the roustabouts, and the roustabouts whacked the tent pegs. And the animals took it from everyone. Our schedule was relentless. We did a parade at 11, a matinee at 2, and an evening show at 8. In between, you mended your costume, you rehearsed, or you tried to sleep on a trunk. But sleep was a commodity we couldn't afford. The jumps, the train rides between towns, were getting longer. We'd tear down in Omaha at midnight. The teardown is a reverse miracle. The big top comes down in 20 minutes. It's chaos. Chains rattling, men screaming, "Heave!" The ground shaking as wagons are loaded onto the flat cars. You sleep on the train, vibrating, waking up every time the engineer hits the brakes. Then you wake up in Lincoln, or Grand Island, or distinct nowhere. You do it all again. One Tuesday, somewhere near the Colorado border, I woke up with a fever. My throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. I went to the company doctor, a man whose medical license was probably written in crayon. "Grip," he muttered, handing me a bottle of brown liquid that smelled like turpentine. "Take a swig. If you can walk, you can work." "I can barely stand," I rasped. "Then spin sitting down," he said. "Miss a show, it's a $5 fine. Break a contract clause, they dock your holdback." I performed. I spun in the air, fever dreaming, seeing double. I landed wrong once, jarring my ankle, but I smiled. Always the smile. The economic noose tightened slowly. We were paid in cash, but we spent in scrip at the company store. The pie car, the dining car on the train, charged premium prices for coffee and sandwiches. A ham sandwich cost $0.25. In town, it was $0.05. But we were never in town long enough to shop. We were captured customers. I needed new slippers. Mine were worn through to the skin. I went to the wardrobe mistress. "That'll be $4, hun," she said, marking it in a ledger. $4, I cried. "That's almost a third of my week's pay." "Imported leather," she shrugged. "Company policy, you want to perform barefoot? Go ahead. But if you get splinters and can't work, that's a fine." I bought the shoes. I ate less pie car food. I started hoarding apples from the horse feed. Despite the hardness, there were people who made the world softer. That's how I met William Johnson. The world knew him as Zip the Pinhead. He was a star of the sideshow, a microcephalic man with a tapered head and a spirit as wide as the horizon. One afternoon, between shows, I was sitting near the sideshow banner line, trying to rub the ache out of my shoulder. William sat next to me. He was peeling an orange. "They staring at you again, little bit?" he asked. His voice was gentle, cultured even. In the ring, he grunted and acted wild because that's what they paid him for. But backstage, he was just William. "Just the usual," I sighed. "A kid poked me, asked his ma if I was a monkey." William nodded, handing me a slice of orange. "I know, they look at us and they see a mirror but a broken one. They see what they're afraid of. Chaos, mutation. It makes them feel safe to be normal. We sell them their own normalcy, Eliza, that's the trade. We take their money, they take their comfort." "It makes me feel small," I whispered, "and I'm already small enough." "Small is just a measurement," William smiled, tapping his temple. "Inside here, you got to be a giant. You got to fill up the room so much there's no space for their pity." He taught me how to stare back, not with anger but with presence. When they gawked, I learned to look them in the eye until they looked away. It was a small rebellion, but it was mine. Then there was Happy Holmes. Happy was a clown, but not the scary kind. He was an August clown, the one who gets the pie in the face, the one who falls down. He was in his 50s, with knees that clicked like castanets. During a rainstorm in Denver, a deluge that turned the lot into a swamp-like mess, we were huddling under a wagon. The canvas was leaking, dripping muddy water onto my one good costume. I started to cry, just a little. It was the exhaustion, the cold, the sheer misery of being wet for 3 days straight. Happy reached into his oversized polka-dot pocket and pulled out a harmonica. He started playing a bluesy, mournful tune that somehow made the rain sound rhythmic. "Don't waste the water, kid," he said, wiping grease paint from his cheek. "Tears just rust the machinery." "I hate this," I sniffled. "I hate the mud, I hate the fines." "Yeah," Happy nodded, "it's a grinder, but listen." He gestured with the harmonica toward the connection. I listened. Over the sound of the rain, I heard it, the crowd. They were stomping their feet. They were clapping, waiting. "Those folks," Happy said, "they spent their egg money to be here. This is the Depression before the Depression, kid. The farms are failing. The banks are closing. Their lives are hard, harder than ours maybe. And for 2 hours, we make them forget the crop failed. We make them forget the bank is coming for the tractor. That's a holy thing. Mud washes off. That feeling, that sticks." He was right. I saw it in the faces of the small towns, in places like McCook, Nebraska, or Colby, Kansas. When the parade rolled down Main Street, the shops closed. The school let out. Old men took off their hats as the calliope wagon passed. I remember a boy in Colby. He couldn't have been more than 10, wearing overalls held up by a piece of twine. He found me near the water wagons. "Are you the flying girl?" he asked, eyes wide as saucers. "That's me," I said, putting my hands on my hips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth river stone. "I don't have no money for a souvenir," he said. "But this is a good skipping stone. It flies good. I want you to have it." I took that stone. I still have it. It was payment, cleaner and more honest than any envelope from the paymaster. But the grind wore us down. The tension backstage grew as the season dragged into September. The heat broke, replaced by a biting wind sweeping down from the Rockies. And then the accident happened. It was a Tuesday matinee. The rigging was slick with humidity. I was up on the pedestal, preparing for the triple spin. Nikolai was down below. As I launched, something felt wrong. The timing was off. A split second, a heartbeat. I spun. Nikolai's feet came up to catch me, but I was too far fast. His heel clipped my hip. I didn't land in the cradle. I careened off, tumbling sideways into the net. The net is safety, but it's not soft. It's rope. It burns. I hit hard, bouncing, my leg twisting underneath me. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the tent. I lay there for a second, the world spinning. Pain shot up my calf like a lightning bolt. "Up, get up," the ringmaster hissed from below. "Bo." I dragged myself up. I couldn't put weight on my left leg. I hopped to the edge of the net, climbed down the rope ladder using mostly my arms, and collapsed into the sawdust. I bowed. The crowd cheered, relieved they hadn't witnessed a death. Back in the dressing tent, my ankle swelled to the size of a grapefruit. The company doctor poked it. "Sprain," he grunted. "Maybe a hairline fracture. Tape it up." "I can't perform on this," I said, fear cold in my stomach. "You don't perform, you don't get paid." The manager, a weasel of a man named Mr. Grady, stepped in. "And we dock you for the disruption of the show." "Disruption?" I flared, the pain giving me courage. I could have died. The rigging was wet. That's negligence. "Read your contract, Tiny," Mr. Grady sneered. "Clause 14, Section B, performer assumes all risks inherent to the apparatus. You signed it. Now tape it up or pack your trunk. There's 100 girls in Chicago who would kill for your spot." I stared at him. I thought about the $6, the $4 shoes, the fines, the mud. "I'm not packing," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough for Mayworth to hear from 3 rows over. "But I'm not performing tonight. And if you dock my pay, I'm going to the local sheriff in the next town and telling him about the rigged games in the privilege car." The tent went silent. The gambling was an open secret, illegal and high stakes. The managers made a fortune off the townies in the late-night poker games. Mr. Grady's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He stepped closer. "You listen here, you half-pint." "Leave her be, Grady." Mayworth stood up. She was holding a riding crop. She tapped it against her thigh. Clyde Beatty stood up too, holding a chair leg he happened to be whittling. Even Happy Holmes stopped applying his white face. It was a moment, a union of the exploited, the freaks and the wonders standing together against the suits. Grady looked around. He did the math. He could fire me, but he couldn't fire Mayworth. He spat on the ground. "Fine, 1 night off, unpaid, but you're back in the air tomorrow or you walk back to Iowa." He stormed out. May walked over to me. She looked at my swollen ankle. "You got guts, kid," she said quietly. "Stupid guts, but guts." She pulled a flask from her trunk and poured a clear liquid onto a rag. "This is horse liniment. It's gonna burn like hellfire, but you'll be walking by morning." She wrapped my ankle tight. It did burn. I cried into my sleeve so the others wouldn't hear. That night, listening to the show from the darkness of the performer's car, hearing the distant applause I wasn't part of, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving the circus. I was becoming the circus. I was being hardened, tempered like steel in a forge. The train whistle blew, a long, lonely sound cutting through the night. The car jolted. We were moving again, always moving, towards the next town, towards the next dollar, towards the winter that was waiting for us like a predator at the end of the line. I lay on my shelf, the horse liniment stinging, and I closed my eyes. I pictured the skipping stone in my trunk. I pictured the boy's face. And I knew, God help me, I wasn't going to quit. Not yet. The show had to go on, largely because I couldn't afford to stop. The burning of the horse liniment was a kindness compared to the burning of the spotlight on a swollen ankle. But May was right. The morning after the fall, I could walk. It wasn't a pretty walk, more of a hitched shuffle, but it was enough to get me to the cookhouse for coffee, which meant it was enough to get me into the ring. "You're limping," Mr. Grady noted, standing by the entrance with his clipboard, ticking off names like a warden counting prisoners. "It's a stylistic choice," I shot back, adjusting the strap of my silver costume. "Adds drama." He just grunted and marked me present. If I was breathing, I was billing. That was the rule. We moved south as the leaves turned, chasing the warmth, though the humidity of the Mississippi Delta in September felt less like warmth and more like being wrapped in a wet wool blanket. The route book called for 100 towns in 100 days. 100 distinct main streets that looked identical. 100 mayors giving keys to the city to Mr. John Ringling while we sweated in the sun. 100 nights of tearing down the world and putting it back in a box. Survival wasn't about the big moments anymore. It wasn't about the soaring. It was about the small, gritty economies of pain. I learned to tape my ankle so tight my toes went numb. I learned to sew hidden pockets into my leotard to hide my tips, because if the managers saw cash, they'd invent a new deduction. Damaged costume fee. Otto Ringling, Mr. John's brother, the ledger keeper of the operation, declared one payday. "That sequin on your left hip is missing." "It fell off during the charivari," I argued, tired and smelling of elephant dust. "Because the costume is 3 years old." 20 cents, Otto said, not even looking up. He had a calculator for a heart. "Next." To make up the difference, I started taking extra shifts in the sideshow. The kid show, we called it. It was the underworld of the underworld. For an extra 50 cents a day, I would sit on a velvet stool next to the sword swallower and the bearded lady just existing. "The smallest acrobat in captivity," the barker would scream through his megaphone. "A living doll, a marvel of miniature humanity." Sitting there under the canvas flaps, I bonded with the cast of outcasts. There was a man billing himself as Jojo the dog-faced boy, the successor to the original Fedor Jeftichu. His real name was Arthur. He suffered from hypertrichosis. Thick, dark hair covered his entire face. Beneath the hair, he had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen and a voice like a radio announcer. "You know what the worst part is?" Arthur told me one afternoon in Tupelo while we shared a cigarette behind the tent. "It's the kids. The adults, they stare with that polite cruelty. But the kids, they're disappointed I don't bark." "Do you ever want to?" I asked, swinging my short legs from the crate I sat on. "Sometimes," he chuckled, a low rumble. "Sometimes I want a bite, but a biting dog gets put down, Eliza. A performing dog gets fed." That was the truth we all chewed on. We were domesticated monsters. The women had it harder. Bird Millman, the queen of the high wire, became a sort of distant idol to me. She didn't use a balance pole. She used a parasol and sheer audacity. She danced on a wire 40 feet in the air like it was a sidewalk. But even Bird, with her fame and her salary, wasn't immune. I saw her once, after a show in Arkansas, cornered by a group of local town councilmen near the dressing tent. They were drunk on bootleg whiskey. Prohibition was technically the law, but the circus carried its own wet ecosystem. "Come on, Birdie," one of them slurred, reaching for her arm. "Show us how you balance, maybe up close." Bird didn't flinch. She just opened her parasol, right in his face, popping it open with a sharp snap. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice ice-cold. "I walk on steel cables in a gale. Do you really think you can unbalance me?" She walked away, head high, but later I saw her in the dressing wagon, her hands shaking as she removed her pins. We shared a look in the mirror. It was the look of prey that had just escaped the predator, knowing the predator would be back tomorrow in a different town, with a different face. "Don't let them make you feel small, tiny," she told me, catching my reflection. "They pay to see us because they know, deep down, they're stuck. We're the birds that flew the coop. They hate us for it, and they love us for it." The small towns were contradictions. In the dusty bowls of Oklahoma, where the soil was already turning against the farmers, the circus was a lifeline. I remember pulling into a town called Enid. The despair hung over the place like smog. Men sat on porches, staring at dried-up fields. But when the calliope started, that steam whistle organ that sounds like a choir of merry banshees, the town woke up. They scraped together nickels from jars, traded eggs for tickets. The circus was the only thing happening that wasn't a foreclosure. I watched a family come through the midway. The father wore a suit that was shined at the elbows. The mother looked exhausted. But their little girl, holding a bag of peanuts, looked at the banners flapping in the wind like they were flags of a conquering army of joy. "Is it real, Daddy?" she asked, pointing at the painting of the hippopotamus. "It's real, sweetheart," he said, and for a moment he stood straighter. He was the man who brought the world to his daughter. The circus gave him his dignity back, even if it took his last dollar. But the grind, the ceaseless, bone-pulverizing momentum. We jumped 120 miles that night. The train cars were leaking. It rained, and the roof of the sleeper car dripped a steady rhythm onto my face. Drip, check, drip, check. Then came the sickness. Cholera scare in the menagerie, 2 monkeys died, the rumor mill went wild. "It's the water in Memphis," someone said. "It's the tainted meat." We boiled everything. We washed our hands in vinegar until they cracked. We looked at each other with suspicion. A cough in the night was a terrified accusation. In 1926, the breaking point almost came. We were in Pennsylvania, coal country. The miners were talking union. The word seeped into the circus lot. Strike. It started with the roustabouts, the men who drove the stakes. They were working 18-hour days for pennies, sleeping under the wagons. One morning, the sledge gang simply sat down. They refused to raise the big top. The panic among the management was immediate. A show that doesn't go up loses thousands. Mr. Grady ran around like a headless chicken. "Get up, get the hammers," he screamed. A burly stake driver named O'Malley spat tobacco juice on Grady's boot. "Not till we get $1 raise and meet every day." The performers were torn. We were sympathetic, God knows, but if the tent didn't go up, we didn't perform. If we didn't perform, we didn't eat. "Stay out of it," Mayworth advised me, grabbing my arm as I watched the standoff. "The owners will break them. They always do. Don't be collateral damage." She was right. The local sheriff arrived with deputies. There were clubs. There was blood in the sawdust. By noon, the tent was going up. The ringleaders of the strike were gone, dumped on the side of the road, replaced by hungry locals desperate for work. We performed that matinee with smiles plastered on, but the air smelled of ozone and betrayal. That was the summer I fell in love, or what passed for love when you're living in a kaleidoscope. His name was Jack. He was a rigger, one of the guys who climbed the high poles to string the safety nets. He had hands like shovels and a smile that was missing a canine tooth. We met over a bucket of water near the horse tent. "Heavy for a little thing," he said, taking the bucket from me. "I can lift my own weight," I said defensively. "I don't doubt it," he laughed. "I've seen you fly, Tiny. You got wings." It was a romance of stolen moments. A touch of hands in the chow line, a whisper behind a wagon during the spec. We sat on the roof of the train car one night as we crossed the Mississippi, watching the moonlight on the black water. "I'm gonna leave this life," Jack told me, the wind whipping his hair. "Got a cousin in Detroit. Ford is hiring. $5 a day, real money, a bed that doesn't move." "Take me?" I asked, looking at the stars. He looked at me, sadness in his eyes. "You belong to the air, Eliza. I'm just a guy who ties knots. You'd wither in a factory town. People would. Well, they'd stare, but it wouldn't be because you're a star. He left in St. Louis, just didn't get back on the train. I waited for him in my berth, listening for his footsteps in the corridor. They never came. The train lurched forward and I cried into my pillow, muffling the sound so the midget troop in the next bunk wouldn't hear. They were rowdy, played poker all night, drank bathtub gin, and laughed loud to cover the silence of their own loneliness. I envied them the noise. My finances were a disaster. Despite working double duty, the fines, the fees, and the company store debt kept me treading water. I owed the show money for a doctor's visit when I got a boil on my neck from the dirty collars. I owed for a new pair of tights. "You're in the red, Tiny," the paymaster said in October. $7. How can I be in the red? I slammed my hand on the table. I haven't bought a stick of gum in 3 weeks. "Accounting errors corrected from July," he shrugged. "And the advance on your winter quarters rent." Winter quarters. Sarasota, Florida, the only time we stopped moving, but even that wasn't free. We paid rent to Ringling to stay in the barracks Ringling owned, to eat food Ringling sold. It was a perfect circle of extraction. But then the final stretch of the season arrived. The blow-off. We were heading back south, aiming for the barn. The energy changed. We were exhausted, frayed, sustaining injuries daily, but there was a hysterical energy to it. The music of the circus is a strange thing. The band plays the entry of the gladiators, that famous doot-doot-doodaloo song, but by November, the brass players have split lips, the drummers have blistered hands. The tempo speeds up. Everyone just wants to finish. I remember a show in Georgia. The tent was patched in 50 places. The light leaked through like stars. The crowd was thin, cotton prices had crashed, but there was a little girl in the front row, clutching a rag doll. I was up on the pedestal, my ankle hurt, my heart hurt, my bank account was empty. I looked down at her. She looked up. And in that exchange, the ancient contract held. I threw the trick, a double somersault. I caught Nikolai's feet perfectly. I stuck the landing. But as I stood there, panting, arms raised in the V for victory, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Not physical. Spiritual. I realized I was 23 years old, and I had nothing to show for it but a scrapbook of ticket stubs and a body that was aging in dog years. I wasn't a person. I was scenery. I was a momentary distraction from the poverty of the world. Backstage, Arthur Jojo handed me a towel. "Good set," he grunted through the hair. "Arthur," I said, wiping the sweat that stung my eyes, "do we ever get out?" He paused, looking at the bustling chaos of the teardown beginning around us. The elephants were already pushing the wagons. The canvas was already dropping. "Out," Arthur laughed softly. "Eliza, look at us. We made this world because the other one didn't fit. You think you can go back to Iowa? You think I can go back to being a bank clerk? We don't fit in the square holes anymore. We're the round pegs. We're the magic, and the magic burns." He was right. The tragedy wasn't the exploitation. The tragedy was that we loved it. We loved the roar. We loved the movement. We were addicted to the very thing that was eating us alive. The train whistle blew, 2 shorts and a long, the signal for all aboard. I grabbed my bag, I limped toward the tracks. The circus was moving, and God help me, I ran to catch it. Running to catch a moving train is a young person's game, and by 1927, I was feeling very old. I was 24, which in circus years is somewhere near 50. My knees clicked like a Geiger counter when it rained, and my hearing had developed a permanent, low-level hum, the phantom echo of brass bands and screaming crowds. The years between the coal strikes and the Great Crash were a blur of acceleration. The Roaring Twenties were roaring their last, desperate gasp, and the circus was trying to shout louder than the coming silence. Management, sensing the economic tremors before the rest of the country, tightened the screws. Mr. John Ringling, now owning nearly every major circus in America after buying out the American Circus Corporation, was a monopoly unto himself. Monopoly meant power, and power meant pay cuts. 10% reduction across the board. the notice pinned to the cookhouse tent pole read, "Due to rising logistical costs." Logistical costs? Mayworth scoffed, reading it over my shoulder. John Ringling just bought a Rubens painting for his museum. That's where our 10% went, into a canvas of a fat lady eating grapes. We took the cut. We took it because the alternative was the street, and the street was getting colder. The 1927 season began with a disaster that felt like an omen. We were in winter quarters in Sarasota when the hurricane hit. It didn't just rain, the sky opened up and tried to erase Florida from the map. We spent 2 days huddled in the concrete elephant barn, listened to the wind tear the world apart. The sound was like a freight train that never passed. When we emerged, the big top, our cathedral, our home, was ribbons. The practice barns were matchsticks. The lot was a soup of mud and debris. "We rebuild," Ringling commanded, standing in his pristine boots amidst the ruin. "The show opens in Madison Square Garden in 3 weeks, double shifts, no overtime." We rebuilt. I learned how to sew canvas that week, pushing heavy needles through wet fabric until my fingers bled. I learned how to mix sawdust with lime to dry out the mud. We worked alongside the roustabouts, the stars, and the scrubs united by catastrophe. It bonded us in a way the applause never could, because applause is for you, but survival is with you. That season was a grinder. The flu swept through the train again, virulent and nasty. We performed with fevers of 102. I recall doing a handstand on the trinca, feeling the blood pound in my ears, terrified I would pass out and break my neck. But the fear kept me conscious. Fear is a hell of a stimulant. It was during this feverish haze that I grew close to Schlitzie. You might know him from the movie Freaks, but to us, he was just Schlitzie. A man with microcephaly, standing barely 4 feet tall, often dressed in a muumuu for ease of care. He had the mind of a toddler and the soul of a saint. We were sitting on the steps of the pie car one night in Tennessee. The crickets were loud. Schlitzie was humming a tune, rocking back and forth. "You like the moon, Schlitzie?" I asked, pointing up. "Moon," he chirped, clapping his hands. "Bright." He didn't care about the pay cuts. He didn't care about the Great Depression looming on the horizon. He cared that the moon was bright and that I had given him a piece of chocolate. "They treat you bad sometimes," I whispered, mostly to myself. "They dress you up like a girl. They make you dance." Schlitzie stopped rocking. He looked at me with those large, dark eyes. He reached out and patted my hand. "Tiny good, tiny friend." It broke me a little. We were both small. We were both curiosities, but he had preserved an innocence I had lost somewhere between Olween and Omaha. He was survival in its purest form, joy in spite of everything. The tension backstage reached a breaking point in late 28. Clyde Beatty, now a star with his own ego to match, was pushing the animals harder. He was working with a mix of lions and tigers, a mixed act that was notoriously dangerous because the cats hated each other almost as much as they hated him. We were in Chicago, the Coliseum. The air inside was stifling. I was waiting in the wings for the spec. Suddenly, a roar erupted from the steel arena that sounded different. It wasn't the theatrical roar of a cat swatting a chair. It was the guttural scream of a kill. I looked through the curtain. A young tiger, a new male named Sultan, had knocked Clyde down. The chair was splintered. The cat was on top of him, jaws snapping near his throat. The other cats were circling, excited by the blood. The arena attendants were freezing, terrified to enter the cage. Without thinking, a recurring theme in my life, I grabbed a blank pistol from a nearby prop table. It was used by the clowns. Loud noise, no bullet. I ran to the cage bars. I was small enough to fit my arm through. I fired the pistol into the air, bang, bang. The noise in the echo chamber of the arena was deafening. Sultan flinched, his ears flattening. The distraction lasted half a second, but it was enough. Clyde rolled, scrambled to his feet, grabbed his whip, and cracked it with a sound like a gunshot. He drove the tiger back. He stumbled out of the cage, bleeding from a gash on his shoulder. He looked at me, standing there in my sequin leotard holding a smoking clown gun. "Nice shot, Tiny," he panted, his face pale. "I aim for the noise," I said, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the gun. That night Clyde bought me a steak dinner. Real meat, not lion scraps. "You saved my bacon," he admitted, cutting his steak one-handed. "Why?" "Because if the tiger eats you, the show stops," I said, chewing slowly to savor the flavor. "And if the show stops, I don't get paid." He laughed, mercenary. "No," I corrected. "Practical. A circus performer who isn't practical is a dead circus performer." But practicality couldn't stop 1929. We felt it before the stock market crashed. The crowds got thinner. The farmers in the Midwest weren't just poor anymore, they were desperate. The dust storms were starting in Oklahoma, turning the sky a bruised purple. The black blizzards. We played a town in the Panhandle where the dust was so thick inside the tent we looked like ghosts performing in a fog. The audience sat there, handkerchiefs over their faces, watching us. They didn't have money for popcorn. They barely had money for the ticket, but they came. I spoke to a woman after the show. She was younger than me but looked 20 years older, her skin scoured by grit. "Thank you," she said, holding the hand of a boy who was too thin. "We needed to see something. Shiny. Everything is just brown now. We needed to see silver." I looked at my costume, tarnished and patched. "It's just sequins, ma'am." "No," she shook her head. "It's hope. It's proof that there's still a world where people can fly." That was the burden. We were carrying the emotional weight of a collapsing nation. We were the last Technicolor dream before the world went black and white. October 1929. Black Tuesday. The news hit us in North Carolina. The telegraph wires hummed with panic. Banks closing, fortunes vaporizing. Mr. John Ringling lost millions in a day. The mood on the train changed instantly. It wasn't just belt-tightening anymore, it was a siege. Rumors flew that the show would fold early, that we'd be stranded. Stranded in 1929 meant starving. I sat in my berth, counting my hoard. I had saved $300 over 7 years. It was hidden in a hollowed-out book and sewn into the lining of my winter coat. $300. A fortune for a farm girl. A pittance for a life. I looked at my body in the small mirror. I had scars on my ankles from the wire, calluses on my hands from the trapeze. My face had lines around the eyes from squinting into spotlights. I was hardened leather. I knew it was time. If I stayed, I would go down with the ship. The circus would survive, Ringling was too big to fail completely, but the performers, we were ballast. The final show of the season was in Richmond, Virginia. It was cold, a bitter, damp cold that settled in the bones. I stood on the pedestal for the Risley act. Nikolai looked up at me. He looked tired. We were all so tired. "Last one, Tiny," he said. "Make it a high one," I replied. The music started. The Blue Danube Waltz played a little too fast. I leapt. "I want to tell you I felt the magic one last time. I want to tell you I felt like a bird. But I didn't. I felt the mechanics. I felt the pull of gravity, the torque of the spin, the impact of the landing. I felt the job. I came down, hit the mat, and bowed. The applause was polite, thin. The people were worried about their savings, not my somersault. As I walked out of the ring, past the curtain, I stopped. I looked back at the empty sawdust circle under the single work light. The smell, straw, dung, popcorn, sweat, filled my lungs one last time. I went to the pay wagon. I collected my final envelope. I didn't argue about the deductions. I didn't care. I went to the train station, not the circus train. I bought a ticket to Chicago. I had a cousin there, maybe a job in a bakery, somewhere warm, somewhere stationary. Waiting on the platform, I saw the circus train pulling out. The long line of red and silver cars. The chaotic, beautiful, terrible city on wheels. I saw Mayworth standing on the platform of the observation car, smoking a cigarette. She saw me. She didn't wave. She just nodded. A salute from one soldier to another who had served her tour. I survived, that's the headline. I survived the 1920s circus. It took more than agility. It took a callus over the heart. It took the ability to be looked at like an animal and stare back like a queen. It took eating dust and pretending it was sugar. But as the train pulled away, leaving me in the silence of a Virginia night, I felt a phantom ache in my legs. The urge to jump. The urge to fly. Because that's the trick they don't tell you. You can leave the circus. You can wash off the grease paint. You can buy a house and plant a garden and never see an elephant again. But you never really land. Part of you stays up there, in the rigging, in the dark, waiting for the catch. I turned away from the tracks, clutched my coat with the $300 sewn inside, and walked toward the ticket booth. I was Eliza Malone again, but when the clerk looked down at me, quizzical about my height, I didn't shrink. I stood up on my toes. I looked him in the eye. "One ticket," I said, "and make it a window seat. I like to see the world moving." The clerk stamped the ticket. The sound was like a drumbeat. I walked toward the future, a tiny figure in a giant station, walking with the unmistakable, rolling gait of someone who has learned to balance on a wire while the world shakes beneath her feet.